Hello and welcome back, and that is right, today we are returning to the subject of Plex Media Server, and today it is the turn of this, the 1522 Plus from Synology, released at the very end of June 2022. This is a NAS that has split opinion in a number of different ways. Unlike previous generation Synology NASs that have been in this product family of 5 bays, it has eschewed the use of an embedded CPU, embedded graphics CPU there. The DS1522 there, as you can see on screen, running DSM 7.1. This arrives with an AMD embedded Ryzen, the R1600. It also arrives with 8 gig of ECC DDR4 memory that can be racked all the way up to 32 gig. But as good as that sounds for business and file transmission and file transit and backups and cloud sync and VMs and surveillance and all that stuff, a lot of you want to know how this NAS and that CPU fares for multimedia. And in today's video, we're going to be running all of our familiar Plex Media Server tests. What are they? I'm glad you asked. Weird if you didn't. We are going to be looking at, there we go, there on the left-hand side of the screen, the 1522. We're going to be testing a few mainstream multimedia movie files there in 720 and 1080p, and then we're going to make our way into the jellyfish files. These are pretty much the go-to beefy files that we test any system. But before we go any further, a whole bunch of disclaimers straight off the bat. Yes, we are testing a lot of familiar files that we've tested in other Plex Media Server test videos. The reason we do that is so we've got some parity, we've got some comparison between all of the different NASs and the files, and you can get some sense of objectivity about how these different NASs play these files. But it's also worth bearing in mind, as we move away from this, that particularly when we get to the jellyfish files, that some of these files are unrealistically large. They start comparable, they start very domestic. This list of files here, for example, are all the same 30-second multimedia file there. And these files, again, this one starts at just 10 megabytes there. And the same bit of 30-second footage by the end is 1.4 gigabytes in size, and that's 30 seconds, which means 2.8 gigabytes every minute, which means a 100-minute movie is going to be astronomical. So do bear that in mind. To give you a sense of perspective on that, over here on the right hand side of the screen, we've got a review here from High Def Disc News, and from their website you can see they did a big old review of the Blu-ray of Batman there, and most of these Blu-rays do arrive with a digital download as well of the same file format. And if you go to the tech specs at the bottom, you can see that this file here is a 90 gigabyte file there. So that is kind of top end right now what you can get, and it's an HDR, so it's an H.265 HDR version there. And again, we've got some HDR testing to do, but again, this gives you some idea about the heft of some of the digital downloads you can get these days. If you download from things like Amazon or Google Play or Apple, they use their own proprietary codecs to avoid a lot of the HEVC H.265 stuff that we'll talk about later on. But still, nonetheless, these are some hefty files we're talking about here. And this file here, I would say, is somewhere here towards the end of this list when we come to that later on. But again, to give that just a little bit more perspective there, we go back into the films tally there. The idea of bit rates and what you look at domestically for 1080p and 4K, you are still going to be sitting somewhere between the 20 to 30 megabits per second bit rate. So again, later on during the video, I will highlight this. But again, let's crack on with a lot of our testing. There is our CPU. And again, that is the dual-core Ryzen CPU there without embedded graphics, something that will become detailed and more apparent later on. And at the bottom there, we've got our memory. We're looking at the green line for both of these because the green is the Plex line. We're not going to bother looking at bandwidth there because we are accessing these NASs over the local area network. The reason we're accessing over the local area network is to get the kind of experience you're going to be getting with a NAS in your home streaming to devices via local network. Now, we are going to be including transcoding there, and indeed, don't worry, if we go down to the transcoder agent there, you can see I have set it up that Plex will, because this is a Plex Pass account as well, use full transcoding that is available to CPU. However, even though it does have the option to use hardware acceleration, the CPU in this NAS does not have an encoding engine. It does not have embedded graphics, and therefore it's got the option, but it can't use it. It's going to be raw CPU power, something that's going to become very apparent later on in this video, I'm sure. Now, if we play our first file, nice and simple, it's going to be the matrix. This is 720p file here. It's an H.264 file. Later on, I will go into more detail why that is relevant. And again, if you've watched my other Plex videos, I know some of this is repetitious, and I am sorry. But a lot of you may be coming to this as the very first Plex video while you've been looking for a new NAS. So I like to make sure that I cover all of the bases. So again, I apologize for any repetition during this. And again, if there are any drops in frame rate, it's not going to be the case of the NAS. It's going to be OBS running here in the background, so do bear that in mind. But for now, if we play this file, we're going to quickly mute it before YouTube decides to punish me there. And as you can see, it's immediately playing the file. It's playing in its original quality there, which is a 720p HD file, and it is 0.7 megabits per second bit rate there. So absolutely fine. And indeed, we can skip ahead. Watching over the network, things are absolutely fine there. We can skip ahead. It plays, lovely stuff there. There's a slight delay there, but again, that may be because I was zooming in and out. Now, while it's doing that, I'm going to talk a little bit now about transcoding, because we're going to do it loads during the course of this video, and I do think it's worth touching on that now. So, with transcoding, a lot of people question the necessity of transcoding. Now, what is transcoding? That is when a file is reshaped, in the case of a multimedia file, on the fly to be changed in its shape or output or any number of ways to be better suited to the destination device. So take this 720p file here. What if, rather than watching it in 720p, we decide to watch it in 480p? We zoom out. As you can see, it's reshaped that file. You're going to see a small bump over here on the right hand side where the CPU had to do a little job there. Now, if you were watching this movie over the local area network on a big screen modern TV, you're not going to transcode. There's no need to do that. But if you're accessing this file on a tablet upstairs on a low internet connection, or a low network connection I should say, to the rest of the network over Wi-Fi, or you're accessing it on the commute on a train to work and you're using the internet connection from your home upload combined with your mobile cell data plan, or you're accessing from a hotel room on the other side of the world on a business trip, or maybe a sneaky little holiday, that is where transcoding can come in, because you may be on a limited data connection, you may be using a smaller device where utilizing an enormous multi-gigabit file is incredibly inefficient to watch on your mobile from the other side of the world, and therefore what you want is a slimmed down version of it to be sent to you. That's where transcoding kicks in. So I'm forcing the transcoding here to kind of simulate those environments where you would be using a device that perhaps does not support the same codec or file format you are watching, or you are in a network environment or internet environment where your connection is limited by a data plan or a quota of data connectivity that you have. So again, as I test these different transcodings, you're going to see that the file format, as we get denser and denser or get to a lower and lower resolution, that the system has to work harder to reshape the file on the fly. Now, you don't have to do this on the fly. You can do this in advance with tools like Handbrake, or even the NAS allows you to have an option within some of its proprietary tools, such as Diskstation, to, in the background, reshape a file in advance. But then you have to have multiple copies of a file, and it's very, very inefficient. But for now, returning to the matrix there, things are running fine. So what about if we go down even lower? Let's go down to 240p. Transcode it down, and we can see that the dark orange line now has now reformatted, and it's now rebuilding. Now, why is the dark orange so important next to the light orange? Well, as you may be aware, maybe perhaps when you're watching this YouTube video, there is such a thing as buffering, encoding, lining up a file. The dark orange is organic playback, 1 second every second being played. The dark orange is how much of the file has been prepared and lined on the tracks for you into the future. If a NAS isn't powerful enough to encode and prepare in the transcoding of a file faster than the playback, then that's useless. That means your file is playing faster than the system can line it up. As you can see on the right hand side of the screen, when we perform that action, there was a big spike of CPU utilization there. That was because the system had to work pretty hard in order to reshape that file. That is the big difference when it comes to looking at how a embedded graphics CPU performs better for these tasks than a non-embedded graphics CPU, because those CPUs have a component on board that is dedicated and designed for that task. And as you can see, if we move along the file and we zoom out again, you will see another spike as we've jumped out of the range of the encoding there. We'll do it once again, and you'll see those spikes. You'll also notice that memory isn't spiking too much. Memory isn't as big a factor when it comes to Plex as a lot of people think. You can get away with 2 gig of memory on a Plex Media Server NAS until you go for some of those ludicrous sized files, something you will see later on. But for now, let's exit the 720p test, make our way back, and this time head into our 1080p test. Little Shop of Horrors, absolute stone cold classic of a film. And again, I say this every time, if you've not watched the original ending, please do. Seek it out. So many people I've met have only ever seen the kind of home nice ending to this. The darker ending is so much better. But this is a 1080p H.264 file here being played in Plex. So we go ahead and play that file. The CPU, as you can see, is now reverting back to its original utilization. Another thing that I often forget to mention in a lot of my videos, I will add, is that when you are running Plex Media Server and you see these big spikes, a lot of people will look at a spike like that and go, nah, it's all right. See, it was still able to play back the file and it wasn't using the whole CPU. Imagine on your NAS you were running multiple processes. Imagine you were running multiple backups, or you were running surveillance station with several cameras at once. All of these processes are going to eat up that CPU and memory there. So don't just look at how much Plex you used, think about how much you have left to be used by the rest of the system. Indeed, Synology NASes do have very good resource management on the fly. Indeed, particularly memory flush caching. Typically a Synology NAS will use more memory than it needs to run an app beautifully and cut down on that cache data intelligently in the background when it needs to. It's a very, very smart system. But when it comes to CPU, it's not as easy to free up those resources as it is with memory. And Plex is all about the CPU memory, CPU resources there. Now, sorry, I just snapped that into there by accident. Again, while I'm doing this, my laptop is ever so slightly off center, so I apologize in advance if occasionally I right click when I meant to left click. But for now, we can carry on, skip forward, open up there. We're watching the 1080p, 1.9 megabits per second, absolutely fine. And we're skipping forward. But as you can see, it's not as snappy as we would have liked to have seen. Now, some of it we can put down to the laptop I'm using to record this. If we open up my task manager there and have a look at the utilization, we can see that onboard graphics there is being spiked up for my recording. Now, I could have used the GPU in this laptop to do it. The reason I don't use my GPU when I do these recordings for here is twofold. One, because the fans on my laptop will be super annoying for the recording there. But two, because sometimes when I've used my GPU, the browser offsets some of the work and it screws up the results. Embedded CPU, the browser doesn't have access to that in the same way of control. So again, that's why we keep that on board. But for now, let's cycle down, and this time we're going to go down to 480p again. We're going to see what the system does. Again, this is where when we did a previous test prior to recording this, I'm not sure if it's gone out yet, when we did our RS422 Plus testing with Plex, we started to see 480p transitions from 1080p, something of a bumpy road for this system. But for now, as you can see, we've shot right up there to system and Plex utilization being exceedingly high there, but still nonetheless, we're able to play the file. We've got a little bit of way ahead there, as you can see. So again, nothing too much to be concerned with. And again, if we skip forward while we're using full CPU utilization, let's see how quickly it reappropriates those resources at 1080p there. But for now, for me, that's running fine. I think we're good there. We're seeing the dip there when it was reappropriating, finding out where to go on the file. Now, if we go for absolute broke, we're going to go down to a 160p file. Now, I call this potato quality. I don't know what device you're ever going to use like this, but perhaps you're on a really, really bad data connection, and what you want is just to hear the audio. Again, some people do, God knows why. But for now, as you can see, to break this down to 160, we're seeing not a good sign. We are seeing the CPU spike there, but that dipped before. That can often mean that the CPU had difficulty, and later on, you're going to see what I mean by that difficulty when there's this sharp downward spike. Because a lot of the time, that means the CPU has tried and failed. And that's because it's hit basically a bricker process there, and it's given up. So right now, it is desperately trying to play potato quality, and it's buffered a little bit, but it's having difficulty playing it and buffering at once. And look down there, we've now gone down to gutterball. Now, if I pause this, which I'm not going to do, and give the system time to cycle ahead and encode the file, it will do it and it will play it. But we're still going to hit a wall later on when we run out of road where the system has not encoded far enough ahead. But as you can see, to turn this mammoth 2 megabits per second 1080p file down to 160p at 0.2, this system is not having it. So for now, I'm going to call that a fail and move on to the jellyfish files. I should have mentioned in the introduction to this video, I apologize if there's a kind of hummy background with these videos. Right now, I'm surrounded by a plethora of Synology, QNAP and TerraMaster NASes for a big comparison piece I'm working on. But the consequence is that right now on screen, there's absolutely loads of NASes around me. They're both on screen and physically around me from different brands. So it's very hard to limit a lot of that background noise. So I apologize if that's coming through. So, what about the 1080p test files here? What about the 4K? What about the jellyfish files? Because, again, as mentioned, these files get progressively bigger and bigger and bigger as the formats get bigger and bigger. Just to put that into a little bit of context and perspective, I should say, with H.264 files, this is a compression technique, H.264, and this is how they get movies that are on enormous big screens, cinema, IMAX, etc., to fit onto a file that you can play on your telly at home. It's a compression technique, and H.264 is pretty much out there. It's been around for a number of years, and although it's not the most efficient codec out there, and I'll get onto that in a bit, I say codec, I meant compression technique, it is still a very good compression technique, and everyone has access to it. It is pretty much free license, and that's why everyone supports it. However, HEVC, otherwise known as Highly Efficient Video Codec, or by the name H.265, is a newer and more efficient compression technique. However, the patent and the ownership and the licensing is shared across multiple parties, and it can be very expensive, difficult, or impossible for some client hardware devices to play it. Now, this doesn't just extend to NASes. Do you remember when you would try to play a file on your Windows laptop, double-click it, and Windows Media Player would click up and go, we can't play this file, we don't have permission to play this compression technique or file format? That was to do with licensing, whereas when you played it in VLC, it played every time. This is what I mean about the licensing, and there are plenty of devices, not just NASes, but we're talking smart TVs, we're talking a lot of mobile phones, even home consoles, that are unable to play HEVC files because they don't have the license. They have the hardware, but not the license, and the result is that when you try to play these files, it will automatically transcode and convert them. Remember earlier on when we were reshaping those files? Well, if you try to play an HEVC or H.265 file on a system that does not have the license to play it, you will automatically transcode. And that is why CPU hardware resources are so dang important. So, let's play that first file there. Now, once again, bear in mind, these files start at 10 megabytes per second and end at 1.4 gigabytes. And again, remember, it goes from 1080p all the way down to 4K, and the bit rate goes nuts from 3 to 400. The same 30-second file. So if we play that first file, bang, there in the window, we're going to have no difficulties. It's going to fire it out. CPU is barely going to notice. Now, we're playing it in its original quality, the dark orange, all the way through. This file is going to have no difficulties whatsoever. As we go through these, we're only going to quickly test the H.264 files. So we'll try the next one. This is a 10 megabits per second bitrate HD H.264. and boom, open it up there. Oh, sorry, right click. I warned you that would happen. If we go there at the bottom, as you can see, 1080p, dark orange playing all the way to the end. We can skip forward and back. I will try not to right click again like an absolute burk. And there we are, absolutely fine there. Again, if I do that again, I might just get angry and smash this laptop. Next, we're going to go for the 30 megabits per second file there. And again, this is, oh no, we've gone HEVC, I apologize. We're going to go for the 30 megabits per second H.264. But just before I play that, even though I just clicked that file in error, look at what the CPU did over here when I accidentally played an HEVC file. That is a little teaser trailer for how bad things are going to go later on. So we'll come back out. So again, we're going for the 30 megabit H.264. Bring it up. As you can see, the dark orange is filling up a little slower, but still filling it all the way to the top. 1080p is not going to be difficult for this system. Come out there, we're going for the 100 megabits per second file there. We're going to go ahead and click play. I'm going to be a monster and sip my coffee. And as you can see, the dark orange is taking a little longer, but still nonetheless, it's playing the file, and it's just about outpacing playback there. Not loads, but it's still outpacing playback. And we're starting to see bumps in the road here with regards to H.264. Something 1080p we've not really experienced up to this point. Now this is where we're going to hit a problem, because now we're in 4K. Now 4K files are a different kettle of fish. A CPU, it's not the same as playing an HD file, a 1080p file. It's not, it's the UHD bit is the killer here more than the 4K bit. It's not just the resolution, it's the density. So if we play this file and we open up at the bottom, we are going to see something different. We're playing it at the original quality. We're trying to allow it to play its file. But as you can see, we just hit a wall. We're not going anywhere. We're at 0.04. And right now, this is not a great deal to write home about. This is not what I would call a successful venture by any means. Now, this is trouble. When a file stops here, this generally means that the CPU is having difficulty leveraging both playback and encode. So, as you can see, it kicked us out. It was unable to provision the resources to do both tasks. However, let's play that file again, but this time, when we open it up, we're going to ask the system to convert automatically to the best version of the file it can play. Now, there's still no guaranteeing it's going to play this, but this is when we can try to use some of those CPU resources to reshape that file for us. And as we can see, the CPU is now trying here on the right hand side of the screen to play that file to the best of its ability. But again, a CPU not having embedded graphics is going to be the kicker here. This is why when I reviewed the 1522, both in my full length and half length review, I mentioned multimedia utilization with the CPU was always going to be something of a low glass ceiling. It's going to try and sort it, and even if it plays, I query whether this system is going to be able to lay down the track for the playback train to be able to do its job. But right now, I'm not getting no success, and right now, I would not comfortably recommend 4K on this system. Bear in mind that yes, this is quite a dense file at 120 megabits, but this is still a 4K file, and even low 4K playing natively is going to be challenged, a bit of a challenge for this system. We're going to go for our last file, a 200 megabit version, but this time, because we know it's not going to play it, it couldn't play the lesser version, but what if we convert it down to 1080p? We're just going to let it see if it does its job before I select anything here. But right there, not really seeing much to go on with. The CPU isn't spiking, so why don't we convert it down to 1080p at 10 megabits per second. Let's see what this system can do and whether we can have any kind of success with this. Because we're seeing that re-encode there. We're seeing it fill. We're seeing it gradually creep up, and we're seeing the CPU work. So these are all relatively good signs, but I think a lot of us, for a 30-second file, this is a bit of a wait, because this is probably going to creep up to 8 or 9, and it'll almost certainly play the file. But after that, Yep, there we go. It kicked us out anyway there. So for now, I would say that 4K on this system, it might play some really low-end 4K. I mean, but if we're looking at the Batman there, give that a miss. That's not going to happen. So now we move over to the HEVC, that highly efficient video codec there. Once again, remember how quickly it played this file, this H.264 file, and it played it originally. Just straight away, no trouble, no fuss. Watch what happens when we play the same file with the HEVC or H.265 compression technique. We open it up there, wrong one there. It's had to automatically convert it, as you can see there, because it doesn't have the license. You don't even have the option to play it in its original picture quality. And it is converting it there at the bottom. But look at that utilization. This is that 1080p file there. So if you have a library that is mostly made up of H.265 files, you may hit something of a difficulty. Now, you may be using client hardware that does have an H.265 license or HEVC license and supports HEVC playback. In that case, you're not going to hit these problems. But I would argue the majority of users do not have it. And playback there is only barely staying ahead. So overall, I call that a success, but only barely. Next up, a 10 megabits per second file there. So again, I'm just going to cough. This file here, again, we're seeing it, attempting it. We're seeing that encode. We're not really seeing what I would call promising respects here in terms of multimedia on this. It's trying, but how much it's succeeding, I would question there. And again, it's playing, but let's see if it can still outpace there. If this was a horse race, I'm sure I'd have a much snappier way to describe what we're seeing here on screen. But unfortunately, it's not a horse race and I can't be snappy. But for me, even if it manages to do this for 30 seconds, if this file was a minute long, there's no way it would achieve it. And I think we're going to see a freeze, and there you go. For me, that file, it failed. So we now know that if we move our way along, that it's not going to be able to play the other versions of this file. Case in point, the 30 megabits per second file there, it's going to try and give it a go. But if it couldn't do the other two, and these are only going to get progressively harder there, doing the automatic conversion. And again, if we try to do an automatic or we try to do any of the lower res files, these are going to be harder work than what we're already trying there. So there's no point attempting them. You may think, conversely, that converting this file to something smaller would make it easier, but it really doesn't, because although the output file is going to be smaller, the work to convert a dense file like that to this is actually a great deal more, because there's more pixels and more surface area to muck around with. But as you see, we've hit a wall and failed again. And again, we can try this down here. We can try for the 100 megabits per second file, and we will be wrapping things up shortly. For now, opening it up at the bottom, and again, still not great there. We're seeing it move along, but again, not fab. It's going to be jumpy, it's not going to do the job, and again, I would not recommend this NAS right now for HEVC or H.265 playback unless you are using an HEVC compliant device and you are utilizing some pretty good media for this, because this is a lot of work that you're going to have to offset against the CPU, and things like caching I don't believe are going to help. They very rarely do with big old chunky sequential data like this. But let's try the 4K files there. So this is going to be an HEVC 4K, and this is HDR as well at 10-bit. So again, I will be flabbergasted if this plays this in any way that I would call positive. I mean, more likely than not, it's going to fail in the danger area, which is this area here. But again, this CPU is not a multimedia CPU in my opinion, and it kind of, I think it will leave some users a little bit sad about the DS1522 Plus with regards to multimedia, because the 1520, the 1019 that came before it were great little multimedia NASes. This one seems to have changed that mold. Now, I'm just going to show you something right now. If I move away from the Plex screen, so let's play that file like so. Let's go for a denser file. In fact, we're going to go for the 200 megabits file. Watch this. So right now, it's going to try and play that file. The CPU there is going to spike up again. It's going to try and lay out that file there in the background. And while it does it, if I move away from that screen, what happens is Plex pauses that file there in the background. The result is that it will hold the file still, and then all of its resources, rather than going into playing, will go into encoding. The reason I'm doing this is two things. One, just to highlight that it will be testing Synology's Video Station application on the 1522 very, very soon, largely because I found that when it comes to playing back media, files always play better on Synology's own app than Plex, because there's less layers with the OS, but there's also better access to the hardware resources with Synology's application. So again, hopefully we'll see better results. But watch what happens. Now we've had more transcoding. So now it will play back this file. It will play back a little, but watch what happens to the encode. It just stops dead because it knows the resources have now been redistributed to both playback, and boom, we hit a wall. So even though it played this file, it only played this file because we paused the file. And that's the big thing. If you are going to consider watching particularly dense media on an NAS like this, you can, of course, line the file up to encode like this, pause the file, and then let the system get some headway. But the problem is, it will not buffer the whole file. It'll only buffer a certain percentage depending on the length of the file. And as soon as you start playing, the resources are now being grabbed by a wider system services. So it's not really the answer to the problem. Whereas if we watch this file now, while it's still attempting to play because we've not paused, we're going to hit a wall. Chances are this spike here is going to start going downwards as the system realizes it's not up to task, and it will kick us out of Plex Media Server. And remember, that was the biggest file we have there. And a reminder from the introduction that the file there that we have for the Batman, and again, what we're being emulated here, is probably somewhere between the 120 and the 200 megabits per second. So do bear that in mind there. But this has been Plex Media Server testing of this, the DS1522 Plus. Now, I will, as mentioned, be doing Video Station testing on this system because I don't think the conversation is over with regards to multimedia on this. I think it is not as well optimized in terms of multimedia enjoyment as the 20 series and the 1520 and the 920. But one of the things I'm looking forward to doing very, very soon, and hopefully will be out within the next month, is Plex Media Server testing on the 1522 Plus versus Plex Media Server testing on the 920. I'm going to be testing these and showing the difference that CPU makes. Between the two of them, I'm going to be testing the same collection of files and showing you how well a file runs on the 1520 the 1522 versus the DS920. So do stay tuned for that Plex comparison. But this has been my Plex Media Server testing of the 1522 Plus. I hope you've enjoyed it. There'll be some articles over on NAS Compares very, very soon detailing this with a lot more information about the files we tested, so do stay tuned for that. If you have enjoyed this video, we do lots of tests not only on Plex but lots of other features and services for lots of different NASs from lots of different brands, and if you want to learn about those, do click subscribe, or if you have enjoyed this video or found it useful, do click like. It genuinely helps me understand what I'm doing right and wrong. And of course, there is the free advice section over on NAS Compares, linked in the description, that's there to help you choose the right NAS or help you with any data storage or network problem you need. We know how much a techie expert costs. That's why we've got the free service. If you enjoy it, donate. Otherwise, you can use it and run away. It's your call. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. I will see you next time.